Today, Eminem is one of the most influential rappers in music history, a global icon with sold-out tours, countless awards, and lyrics that shaped an entire generation. But in 2007, he was found unconscious after a massive overdose, just minutes from death. Fame didn't save him. Money didn't save him. Success didn't save him. Behind the anger and the anthems was a man drowning in childhood trauma, addiction, and silence. This is not the story of how Eminem became famous. This is the story of how he survived. In the summer of 2007, Eminem wasn't living like a superstar. He was barely living at all. His body was shutting down under a dangerous mix of prescription drugs, methadone, Valium, Vicodin. Pills meant to numb pain had quietly taken control of his life. His tolerance kept rising. The doses kept increasing. And one night, his heart simply couldn't take it anymore. Eminem collapsed, unconscious, alone. At the hospital, doctors were blunt. The amount of drugs in his system was enough to kill most people. One of them looked at him and said words that would haunt him forever. He was minutes away from death. Not hours. Not days. Minutes. When he woke up, his body was weak, his memory fragmented, his mind fogged. He didn't feel relieved. He felt confused. Empty. The fame, the money, the legacy, none of it mattered in that moment. All he could feel was the terrifying realization that he had nearly died without meaning to, and without anyone truly knowing how broken he had become. That overdose wasn't just a medical emergency. It was the final result of years of unhealed trauma, pressure, and silence piling up behind the image of an unstoppable icon. And to understand how Eminem reached that point, how a global superstar could end up fighting for his life on a hospital bed, we have to go back much further. We have to go back to a childhood where survival began long before the music ever did. Long before the world knew him as Eminem, he was just Marshall Mathers, a kid growing up in constant instability, never knowing where home really was. His father abandoned the family when Marshall was still a baby. Letters were written. None were answered. The absence wasn't just physical, it became a permanent emotional wound. His mother, Debbie, struggled with addiction and instability, dragging her son through a cycle of cheap apartments, broken furniture, and neighborhoods where danger felt normal. They moved constantly. New schools. New faces. New chances to be targeted. Marshall was small, awkward, and different. That was enough. At school, he was bullied relentlessly. Pushed. Mocked. Beaten. One assault was so severe it left him with a head injury that put him in a coma for days. Teachers saw him as trouble. Classmates saw him as weak. There was no safe place, not at school, not at home. Inside those cramped rooms, with walls too thin and silence too loud, Marshall began to withdraw. He listened. He observed. He absorbed everything, the anger, the humiliation, the feeling of being unwanted. Words became his refuge. Rhythm became his escape. Hip-hop wasn't just music to him. It was armor. He memorized lyrics obsessively. He rewound cassette tapes until they warped. He wrote lines in notebooks like someone trying to breathe underwater. Rap gave him something the world never did: control. In verses, he could hit back. In rhymes, he could exist without apology. But trauma doesn't disappear when you find a voice. It waits. The pain of being abandoned, beaten, and ignored didn't fade. It hardened. It shaped the anger in his delivery. It carved the edge into his words. And even as rap began to give him purpose, it also became a place where his unresolved wounds could hide. That childhood didn't just influence Eminem's music. It built the emotional foundation that would later collide with fame, violently. Because when success finally arrived, it didn't replace the damage. It amplified it. Rap gave Marshall a voice, but the world wasn't ready to listen. In Detroit's underground hip-hop scene, he stepped into freestyle battles fueled by pure hunger. Crowded basements. Smoke-filled rooms. Circles of rappers waiting for someone to slip. Every verse was a fight for respect. Every mistake was punished instantly. And Marshall made plenty of mistakes. He lost battle after battle. He was laughed at. Dismissed as the white kid trying too hard. Detroit didn't care about his pain. It only cared if he could survive the mic. Outside those battles, life offered no safety net. He dropped out of high school. Money was scarce. Bills piled up. He worked low-paying jobs just to stay afloat, all while pouring every spare moment into writing. His notebooks filled faster than his bank account ever did. There were nights when quitting felt logical, responsible, necessary. But something inside him refused. Marshall became obsessed, not with fame, but with mastery. He studied rhyme patterns like equations, counted syllables, rewrote verses dozens of times until they cut deeper than the last. Rejection didn't slow him down. It sharpened him. Still, opportunities didn't come easily. Record labels passed. Doors stayed closed. Years went by with no breakthrough. By the time he reached his mid-20s, he was broke, exhausted, and raising a young daughter in near poverty. The dream was slipping further away with every rejection. Then came one last gamble. A demo tape found its way into the hands of Dr. Dre, a producer who had already built legends. Dre didn't see a gimmick. He heard hunger, precision. Pain turned into weaponized words. That single moment changed everything. But the sudden rise that followed wouldn't bring peace. It would bring pressure, on a scale Marshall was never prepared for. Because when a life built on trauma collides with overnight fame, the impact is never gentle. When success finally arrived, it didn't come quietly. It exploded. The release of the Slim Shady LP turned Eminem from an unknown Detroit rapper into a global phenomenon almost overnight. The world hadn't heard anything like him before: raw, offensive, brilliant, and unapologetically angry. Albums sold by the millions. Awards followed. Headlines multiplied. Then came the Marshall Mathers LP. Then the Eminem Show. Each release pushed him higher, and trapped him deeper. From the outside, Eminem was unstoppable. Sold-out arenas. Fans screaming every word. Grammys on shelves. An Oscar for Lose Yourself. The image was flawless, success built from pure talent and relentless work. But behind the curtain, the pressure was suffocating. Every lyric was scrutinized. Every interview dissected. Controversy followed him everywhere: critics, politicians, parents' groups. He was either worshipped or demonized, rarely seen as human. The expectation to always be sharper, louder, more shocking never stopped. The schedule was brutal. Touring, recording, promotion, repetition. Sleep became optional. Exhaustion became permanent. To keep functioning, he turned to prescription drugs, first to manage pain, then to control anxiety, then simply to shut his mind off. What began as a coping mechanism slowly turned into dependency. And then came the losses. The death of Proof, his closest friend and creative anchor, hit like a silent earthquake. The person who understood him without explanation was suddenly gone. The grief had nowhere to go, except deeper inside. Eminem kept performing, kept recording, kept smiling for cameras. But inside, something was breaking. The fame that once felt like victory became a constant threat, a spotlight that never turned off, exposing wounds he never learned how to heal. The anger in his music intensified. The isolation grew heavier. And the pills became easier to reach than silence. Success hadn't healed the damage from his past. It had magnified it. And without realizing it, Eminem was drifting toward the darkest chapter of his life, one that would nearly end everything. Proof wasn't just Eminem's best friend. He was his anchor. Long before the fame, before the Grammys and stadium lights, Proof stood beside Marshall when no one else did. They battled together. Failed together. Survived Detroit together. Proof was the one person Eminem didn't have to explain himself to, the one voice that could cut through the noise and remind him who he really was. Then, in April 2006, Proof was gone. Shot and killed in a Detroit nightclub. There was no dramatic farewell. No closure. Just a phone call that changed everything. For Eminem, it wasn't just grief. It was disorientation. The person who had kept him grounded in reality, the bridge between Marshall Mathers and Eminem the icon, was suddenly erased. And with that loss, the last piece of emotional stability he had quietly depended on disappeared too. He didn't process the pain. He buried it. Eminem stopped trusting people. Stopped opening up. The studio became quieter. The jokes faded. The anger turned inward. Without Proof, success felt meaningless, and loneliness felt permanent. Sleep became harder. Silence became unbearable. And the pills became necessary. Prescription drugs weren't about getting high anymore. They were about numbing absence. About shutting down memories. About surviving nights when grief crept in unannounced and refused to leave. Proof's death didn't just hurt Eminem. It unraveled him. The world still saw a superstar at the top of his game. But behind the scenes, Eminem was drifting, disconnected, exhausted, and slowly losing control. The man who once used words to survive was now using chemicals to escape them. And no one stopped him. Because from the outside, everything still looked like success. But internally, Eminem was already collapsing, step by step, toward the moment that would almost end his life. After Proof's death, Eminem didn't fall apart all at once. He slid. At first, it was subtle. Missed calls. Cancelled sessions. Long gaps of silence where music used to live. The studio lights stayed off more often than on. When he did show up, something was different. The focus was gone. The fire felt distant. The pills filled that space. What started as prescription medication became routine, then necessity. Painkillers for the body. Sleeping pills for the nights. Anti-anxiety meds for the constant noise in his head. Each one promised relief. Together, they created a fog he couldn't escape. Eminem's tolerance climbed fast. The doses that once calmed him stopped working. He needed more to feel the same numbness. And then more again. The line between medication and addiction disappeared without warning. As his dependency grew, his world shrank. Friends noticed the changes but didn't know how to intervene. Fame had built walls around him, security, schedules, handlers, all designed to protect the brand, not the man inside it. He became isolated inside his own success. Paranoia crept in quietly. He stopped trusting people. Questioned intentions. Heard criticism even in silence. Sleep deprivation distorted his thinking, and the drugs only amplified it. Some days, he barely recognized himself. Others, he didn't care to. Creatively, he felt lost. The words didn't flow like they used to. When they did, they felt hollow. The anger was still there, but it no longer had direction. Writing, once his lifeline, became another source of frustration. Behind closed doors, Eminem was deteriorating, physically and mentally. Weight fluctuated. Memory blurred. Time slipped. Days blended together in a cycle of pills, isolation, and exhaustion. Yet publicly, the image of Eminem remained intact. Appearances were made. Expectations were met. No one saw how close he was to the edge. Because the collapse wasn't loud. It was silent. And that silence was slowly killing him. By 2007, Eminem wasn't managing his addiction anymore. It was managing him. The pills were no longer about sleep or pain. They were about functioning. About getting through a day without collapsing under the weight of his own thoughts. His tolerance had reached a dangerous level, forcing him to take amounts that would have been fatal to most people. Physically, his body was giving warning signs. Extreme fatigue. Disorientation. Memory loss so severe he struggled to remember entire periods of his life. Mentally, the paranoia deepened. He withdrew further, cutting off even those who cared about him most. And still, no one pulled the brakes. Then one night, his body finally did. Eminem overdosed on a lethal combination of prescription drugs. He collapsed, unconscious, his system overwhelmed. By the time he reached the hospital, doctors were stunned by the amount of substances in his body. One of them told him later, without drama or exaggeration, he was minutes away from dying. Not days. Not hours. Minutes. When Eminem woke up, the shock wasn't relief. It was fear, the kind that cuts through denial. His organs had nearly shut down. His brain had been starved of oxygen. He was warned that if he survived, recovery wouldn't be simple. It might not even be complete. For the first time, the illusion shattered. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't burnout. This was death, standing close enough to touch. Lying in that hospital bed, stripped of the persona, the accolades, the anger, Eminem faced a truth he could no longer outrun. If nothing changed, there would be no comeback story. No legacy. No music. Just silence. That overdose didn't end his life. But it ended the way he had been living it. And for the first time, survival became more important than success. Surviving the overdose didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a warning. When Eminem left the hospital, his body was weak and his mind was fractured. He struggled to concentrate. Simple tasks felt unfamiliar. His memory was unreliable, as if pieces of his life had been erased. The doctors were clear, recovery would be long, and relapse was a real possibility. There was no dramatic moment of enlightenment. No instant transformation. Instead, there was fear. For the first time, Eminem wasn't afraid of failure or criticism. He was afraid of not waking up. Afraid of leaving his daughter behind. Afraid that if he kept living the same way, there would be no second chance. So he made a decision that felt small, but wasn't. He chose sobriety. Rehabilitation stripped him of control, routine, and ego. There were no stages. No applause. Just quiet days built around discipline. Wake up. Eat. Train. Repeat. At first, he replaced addiction with physical exhaustion, running miles until his lungs burned, lifting weights until his body shook. It wasn't about looking strong. It was about staying alive. Mentally, the battle was harder. Without the pills, the pain came back, grief, anger, unresolved trauma from childhood, and the loss of proof. He had to sit with feelings he'd avoided for decades. Therapy forced him to confront parts of himself he had buried under fame and noise. Slowly, something changed. The fog lifted. His focus returned. Words began to feel sharp again. Not louder, clearer. Music stopped being an escape and became a mirror. He wasn't trying to shock the world anymore. He was trying to understand himself. This time, there was no rush to reclaim the spotlight. Eminem wasn't chasing relevance. He was rebuilding a life. And in that quiet rebuilding, far from headlines and expectations, he discovered something more powerful than success. He learned how to survive without destroying himself. After his recovery, Eminem didn't return as the same man the world had lost. He returned quieter. More controlled. More deliberate. The chaos that once defined his life was replaced by structure. Days were built around routine, discipline, and boundaries. He protected his sobriety the way he once protected his anger, fiercely. Fame was no longer the goal. Stability was. When he released Recovery, the title wasn't symbolic. It was literal. The album wasn't about proving dominance or winning critics. It was about honesty, acknowledging weakness, mistakes, and the cost of survival. For many listeners, it became more than music. It became proof that falling apart doesn't have to be the end. As the years passed, Eminem continued to evolve. Projects like Kamikaze showed that the fire was still there, but it was controlled, sharpened, not reckless. He no longer needed validation. He no longer needed to be liked. His work spoke from experience rather than pain alone. Behind the scenes, his greatest achievement wasn't measured in charts or awards. It was consistency. Years of sobriety. Years of showing up. Years of choosing life, even when it was uncomfortable. Eminem also became something unexpected, a quiet symbol for people battling addiction, depression, and self-destruction. He rarely preached. Rarely explained. His existence alone sent a message: survival doesn't always look triumphant. Sometimes it looks disciplined. Sometimes it looks boring. Sometimes it looks like staying. Today, his legacy reaches beyond rap. He represents the idea that talent doesn't protect you from trauma, but responsibility can protect you from yourself. That even the loudest voices carry silent battles. And that reinvention doesn't require erasing who you were, only understanding why you became that person. Eminem didn't conquer his past. He learned to live with it. And for millions watching from the outside, that quiet endurance became the most powerful message of all. Eminem's story was never really about rap. It was about a boy who grew up feeling unwanted. A man who turned pain into power. And a survivor who learned, the hard way, that success cannot heal wounds you refuse to face. At his lowest point, fame didn't save him. Money didn't save him. Applause didn't save him. What saved Eminem was something far less glamorous: discipline, honesty, and the willingness to stay alive when quitting would have been easier. He didn't rebuild his life to be admired. He rebuilt it to be present. Today, when people talk about Eminem's legacy, they mention records, awards, and influence. But beneath all of that is a quieter truth: millions see themselves in his struggle. In the addiction. In the anger. In the feeling of being broken long before adulthood begins. His story reminds us that survival isn't dramatic. It's repetitive. It's choosing the same hard decision every day. And maybe that's the real message. You don't need to be perfect to move forward. You don't need to erase your past to outgrow it. You just need to stay. Eminem did. So now the question isn't what he survived. The question is, what's your story?